Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Big Mountain Dev and Data session with Stephen Lambert. You're in room 4, and after my short introduction, Stephen is going to present Designing for Accessibility Using the Lenses of Accessibility. If you have questions, please ask them either in Slido, just to the right of the presentation here, or go ahead and throw them out in the room 4 on our Slack channel, and we'll monitor those. And there's little spots in the presentations where we'll give those questions to Stephen. If you're having issues with the conference today, there's also a BMDD support chat channel in Slack where you can get some quick help from our volunteers. And as always, after the session, please do leave some feedback, both for the conference and for our speaker. One of the trivia tidbits that Stephen gave me as we were getting ready to share today is that he maintains a gaming library in JavaScript to help people build games. It's a very compact, small library, so it's one that's really appreciated by people who are trying to build small games or are building games for a competition. So with that introduction, we're excited to have Stephen here today. I'm going to turn the time over to him. Stephen, thank you for your preparation today, for your willingness to help out the community and to share some of your knowledge and experience with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So just kind of want to preface this talk, even though it says designing for accessibility, this talk is really good for anyone, be them designers or developers or even management or anyone in the company. It's really focused on about how do you take a design, either in paper design or maybe one that's already been built on a web page, and how do you critique it to make sure that it is indeed accessible and common solutions that you can apply. So first, I just want to say my name, as he said, was Stephen Lambert. If I'm a web developer and an accessibility specialist at DQ Systems, I maintain the open source Axe Core accessibility testing engine. My email is stephen@sklambert.com if you want to ask me any questions afterwards. You can also find me on Twitter at Stephen K. Lambert, or my website is stephenklambert.com. Lastly, if you want to find these slides later, I've created a bit.ly link, Lenses of Accessibility, which will take you right to this Google Doc. So hopefully you should be able to find this talk again if you need it. So I want to start out by asking everyone, kind of rhetorically, is this design accessible? So I kind of take a screenshot of the AccuWeather webpage, and here they just kind of have a lot of information. They have videos in their articles, they have a sidebar with lots of images, a couple of dark colors on their site. So to critique the design, how would we go about knowing that this design is accessible? And that's kind of where this talk goes and talks about. So first, accessibility is solved mostly at the design stage. A lot of the times you don't have to write code or JavaScript to fix accessibility problems. Most of the time, the correct solution will be to update the design to better meet the needs of your users. So choices you make in the design stage will directly affect the accessibility of the product. So what does it mean to design for accessibility? Well, consider the following. Good accessible design happens when you view your design from as many perspectives or lenses as possible. Now, a lens is a narrow filter through which a topic can be considered or examined. Often used to examine works of arts or literature or film, lenses asks us to leave behind our worldview and instead view the world through a different context. So I found that when it comes to accessibility, it can be helpful to examine a design through what I call the lenses of accessibility. And those lenses, there are a few of them. There you have the animation and effects lens, or you also have audio and video, color, controls, font, images and icons, keyboard, layout, material honesty, readability, structure, and time. Each of these lenses presents a set of questions to ask yourself about the design. And by using these lenses, you will become more inclusive to the needs of your users and allow your design to be more accessible to all. Now, what these lenses don't do is provide a checklist of items that when followed will make your design automatically accessible. They're merely a design tool. Also, you should know that not every lens is applicable to every design, and what works best in one design may not work best in another. As always, when it comes to accessibility, your best bet is to test your designs with actual users to make sure that they are accessible. So we'll go right in and talk about the first lens, which is the lens of animation and effects. Now, the way this talk is structured is we'll go through each of the lenses. We'll talk about information that applies to those lenses, how those things can affect users, and how then we can improve those things in the accessibility of our users. And then at the end will be a set of questions that you can ask yourself to help you focus on this particular lens. So when it comes to animation and effects, there's a concept called fast flashing, which is any content that flashes more than 3 times a second. Now, this type of content or any high intensity effects or patterns can cause seizures, or also known as photosensitive epilepsy. Photosensitivity can also cause headaches or nausea and dizziness in users. Users with photosensitive epilepsy have to be very careful when they browse the web. They never know when something might trigger a seizure. So to help prevent this, you shouldn't have content that flashes more than 3 times a second. Also, a similar type of effect is parallax motion or motion effects, which can cause users to feel dizzy or experience vertigo. This is known as vestibular sensitivity. Now, the vestibular system is what controls a person's balance and sense of motion. And so when this system doesn't function as it should, it causes users to be dizzy or nauseated. Also, users are pretty easily distracted by content, especially those who have difficulty concentrating. For me personally, I know if there's something updating in the corner of my eye on a web page that I'm viewing, my eye is automatically drawn towards it and I look to see what just updated. And if it keeps happening regularly, I get easily distracted and it kind of ruins my train of thought. So you have to be very careful in how you use constant motion in your designs. And that's not to say all animation is bad. It's just that we should understand why we're using the animation and how to design for safer animations. So to use the lens of animations and effects, you can ask yourself these questions about the design. Are there any effects that could cause a seizure? Are there any animations or effects that could cause dizziness or vertigo through use of motion? Are there any animations that could be distracting by constantly moving or blinking or auto-updating? And is it possible to provide controls or options to stop, pause, or hide the frequency of animations or effects? Are there any questions about the lens of animation and effects?
We haven't had any come in so far.
Perfect.
I think it was pretty clear. That was a good example.
Yeah, so feel free to ask questions and then we'll try to answer them at the end of each of these little sections. So next we have the lens of audio and video. So here I have a little video for everyone. Loading, unadulterated loading. That's kind of how the web in general feels about autoplaying videos and music. So the answer for everyone is don't do it. Autoplay is pretty annoying and it's not enjoyable to try to hunt down the tab in your browser that's playing the music and then try to stop it. Also, videos should have transcripts or subtitles so users can consume it in a way that works best for them. Users who are visually impaired or who would rather read instead of watch the video need a transcript, while users who aren't able to or don't want to listen to the video need subtitles. So there's not too many questions for the lens of audio and video, but you can ask yourself, are there any audio or video that could be annoying by autoplaying? Is it possible to provide controls to stop, pause, or hide any video or audio that autoplays? And do your videos have transcripts and or subtitles? So the next one we have is the lens of color. When it comes to color, there's something called color deficiency or color blindness. The most common being is called deuteranopia, and it affects about 1 in 12 males and 1 in 200 women. The key takeaways are that colors tend to blend or look like one another. So for example, reds, greens, and oranges can tend to look kind of yellowish or pinkish if yellow is pink to you. And rarely can colors look bluish. Most importantly though, all meaning of color is lost when you have a color deficiency. So for example, if we have a typical status page, which shows which services are up or down, users without a color deficiency can see the differences between the reds and the greens pretty easily. However, if you have deuteranopia, this is what it would look like to you. You can see that it all kind of looks yellowish, and we don't know exactly which color means up and which color means down. This is also problematic if we were to try to call out the errors in a form field. So here with 4 different form entries, each of them being highlighted, which form entry has the error. So instead of being able to quickly look at, now we have to kind of look at each of the forms and understand that it's indeed the email that is incorrect. So to fix that, we need to add a non-color identifier, either an icon such as the X, or some text such as the error message, or even a pattern can help denote the differences between the colors. Also, when it comes to colors, we want to make sure that we have good contrast between the foreground and the background. As poor contrast is hard to see if you have low vision, or if you're using a low-end monitor, or if you're even just in direct sunlight, such as looking at your phone outside. It's recommended that you have a contrast ratio between the background and the foreground color of 4.5 to 1. There's a lot of tools online that you can find to help you test the color contrast between 2 colors. Lastly, and not a very common thing to know about, is something called Windows High Contrast Mode. Windows High Contrast Mode is a special setting on a PC that allows the users to completely change the default color scheme of their monitors. And so a lot of times there's not a set color scheme, and users can customize it for their needs. And so to make it the most inclusive as possible, you need to take into account maybe these different Windows High Contrast modes and test them. A lot of times, a common pitfall is that text will disappear in like form labels as the background changes what used to be white into black, and the text in the form doesn't update. So to use the lens of color, you can ask yourself these questions. If the color was removed from the design, how would it provide meaning without using color? Are any colors oversaturated or have high contrast that could cause users to become overstimulated or uncomfortable? There's a lot of colors such as bright yellow, which can cause some users to be uncomfortable. And does the foreground and the background color of all text and icons focus indicators meet contrast ratio guidelines of 4.5 to 1? The next lens is the lens of control. Now, a control is defined as anything that the user can interact with. So be it a button or a link or a form field, or even a div element that has a click handler. When it comes to controls, touch target accuracy is important. I don't know about any of you, but for me, I have a smartphone, and when I'm typing on the keyboard, when it's in portrait mode, I misclick letters all the time. The buttons are too small for my thumb, and it makes it really hard to be accurate. To help solve for that, it's recommended that controls have a 26 pixel minimum touch target, or even 44 pixels at a higher end recommendation. You should also make sure that there's enough spacing between the elements that you don't accidentally click on one instead of the other, and that your visual size of the element should be about 60 to 100% of the touch target size. So you don't want to make the icon too small, but have a larger touch area, as that is also unhelpful to users who don't know that that larger area is there. This can be especially problematic if you use Twitter and you're on your phone and you come to a single line tweet. Every one of these orange boxes is a clickable region in that tweet. And so if you are trying to open the tweet by clicking on the text on that single line, there's a chance you can easily click on the person's name or their handle, or maybe one of the buttons on the bottom, because there's just not enough space between them all. When it comes to form elements, you should always use a label. Without the label, if the user were to type in the text and all you had was a placeholder, which is a common thing to do, the placeholder goes away and then that label is no longer present. So if the user forgets what the label was, without the placeholder there anymore, they'll have difficulty remember what the input does. Not only that, but things called screen readers, which are what users who are visually impaired or blind use to read the contents of the web page to them out loud, they need those labels to know what this form of input does. So to use the lens of controls, you can ask yourself the following questions. Are there any controls not large enough for someone to touch? Are any controls too close together that would make it easy to touch the wrong one? Are there any controls inside another control or clickable region, such as that tweet? Or do all controls have a visible text label? Are there any questions up to this point?
We don't have any questions, but I had a comment that I wrote down that I would have put in. It was really cool what you gave us with the examples of color and contrast. I don't have deuteranopia, but the examples you gave made it really clear how large an issue that can be and how difficult it can be if the design wasn't set up at the beginning in order to account for that. That was really cool. That's something that I haven't seen before.
Oh,
so
thank you. Yeah. There's a lot of cool ways you can, a lot of tools online too that help you to test your images in different types of color deficiency, and you can run them through and they'll change the color of the image for you. And it's really a cool feature.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you.
So the next lens we can talk about is the lens of font. Now, when it comes to font on a page, the design should be flexible enough so that users can increase the font or the line height or the letter spacing to a comfortable reading level for them. On the web, there's something called a custom user style sheet. A lot of browsers allow users to write their own CSS and then inject that CSS into each page they visit. And what that allows people to do is to write custom styles for each website they visit to make their experience better for them. And a lot of times what they're doing is either changing really bad coloring or changing the font to be bigger or more spaced out for them. So when it comes to default font settings on your site, it's always best to make your font legible by increasing the line height to a comfortable default level, making sure your font size is a good default size. It's not common anymore to design fonts with really small, like 10 pixels. That's what we used to use back in the web, back in 2000 era. Now you should be using something bigger. So the recommended, I think, is like 16 pixels. Also, you should make sure that the font styles that you choose for your website won't cause problems for users. Now, users with dyslexia, for example, have trouble reading certain font styles, those being really small text, also italicized text, all uppercase text especially is very hard for users with dyslexia, and even cursive text styles can be very difficult for users to read. So when you're choosing a font, it's best to try to choose one that is comfortable reading for most users. So to use the lens of font, you can ask yourself these questions. Is the design flexible enough that the font could be modified to a comfortable reading level by the user? And also, is the font style easy to read? Next is the lens of images and icons. So if I were to ask you, if you could not view this image, how would you convey its meaning to the user? So a lot of times, maybe when the image doesn't load on a web page, you get text that can replace the image. That text is also what screen readers can use to understand what the meaning of the image is without being able to see it. So when it comes to images, it's always best to describe the image the picture contains. Describe the information the picture contains, sorry. If the image is decorational, it doesn't serve any purpose other than to show something off, or if there's already surrounding text that describes the information in the image, then you don't usually need to add any additional information. For this particular case, what you'll probably want to do is add a data table with the text from the image so that you can easily read that text and see what each of those bar charts is showing. For a more complex example, we can look at some image like this. So if you couldn't see this image, how would you describe or convey its meaning? This image is A Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. And if that's the information that you wanted to get across to the user, that's perfectly fine to say. If you've already in the text said something about Vincent van Gogh's A Starry Night, you probably wouldn't need any additional information as it can be gleaned from the surrounding text. One of the things you shouldn't do is try to describe the information or describe the image itself. So for example, you shouldn't try to say that this is a post-impressionistic painting of a night sky over a small village with a large cypress tree in the foreground. Unless you were specifically wanting that information given to the user because you're talking about certain post-impressionistic paintings and their styles and stuff, then that's probably appropriate. So when it comes to how do you describe the image, we get our best answer. It depends. It's one of the favorite answers we like to give. So it's always kind of funny that it makes sense in this context. So always give information about what the image is. You're trying to convey the meaning to the user and not describe the image itself. So here's another example. What do each one of these icons mean? A lot of times we can probably guess what the first couple are. However, once we get to the middle and beyond, we have to kind of start guessing maybe what those icons are, especially that one in the middle, that lightning. There's a good chance that if you were to guess what it was, you wouldn't think it meant take your accounts offline. What that means is that icons aren't universal. Can mean different things in different cultures, and even to us in the same culture, sometimes we still have to guess what the icon means. So you should always label your icons with the text so that their meaning is completely understood. Lastly, a lot of social websites allow users to upload their own images. In those cases, you should provide a way for the user to enter that text along with the image to describe it. For example, Twitter allows its users to write the text when they upload the image into a tweet. And a lot of other platforms, I think Facebook also does that now. So to use the lens of images and icons, you can ask yourself these questions. Does any image contain information that would be lost if it was not usable? How could I provide the information in a non-visual way? If the image is controlled by the user, is it possible to provide a way for them to enter that alternative text description? The next lens is the lens of keyboard. So a user who uses a keyboard to primarily navigate a web page and doesn't use their mouse will typically use the tab key to navigate to each of the controls in sequence. In America, Western cultures, yeah, the typical sequence is left to right, top to bottom, or a reading order. What that means, though, is that if the user is specifically looking for a control, and that control is tens or hundreds of tabs through the page, it can become very cumbersome to get to that information. So a lot of times, if we can make the most important user flows nearer to the top of the page or to the top of the tab order, as it's called, we can help enable our users to be more efficient and more effective. Now, this isn't always possible and practical to do, so we can provide alternative ways for the user to get to what they want. Now, one great example of this is Facebook. Facebook, if you hit the tab key, they bring up a hidden menu that allows the user then to jump to specific sections in that page. Each of those then saves the user many clicks and tabs to get to what they want. So that's a good shortcut to speed up their ability to interact with the page. Now, when it comes to making sure users can see where their tab is, it's important to always keep the tab focus on. I know it's popular with designers to always try to get you to disable or hide the focus, especially if you're using a mouse. But those focus styles are especially important for keyboard users. Here I have an example of me tabbing through a page. Every time that little black arrow shows up in the bottom left corner, that's me hitting the tab button. And you can see that the page isn't showing me where my tab is. Usually it would show that blue focus ring, but in this case, they've hidden it. And so as a user, I am completely lost when tabbing through this page of where I am. So it's very important that you keep those on. So to use the lens of keyboard, you can ask yourself the questions. What keyboard navigation order makes the most sense for the design? How could a keyboard user get what they want in the quickest way possible? And is the focus indicator always visible and visually distinct? Now, what that means is with that blue focus ring, sometimes you'll have blue buttons on your page, for example. So when the blue focus ring goes to the blue button, visually it may not be distinct enough to know that that is what is currently focused. So in those cases, what you can do is kind of change the color or change the style so that it brings attention to that particular combination of where the user's focus is. The next lens is the lens of layout. Well, a layout in this case means the visual layout, and it should have a meaningful and logical sequence. Again, typical for Western cultures is left to right, top to bottom. The layout should be resizable to a minimum of 320 pixels. That's kind of the default phone size width, or to be able to be zoomed in by the user to 400% without horizontal scroll bars. In terms of accessibility and just user experience, horizontal scroll bars are kind of a big no-no. But so the more you can avoid and adjust your designs to fit these different ratios, the better. Also, there's something called a screen magnifier, which allows users to zoom in a certain section, kind of like a magnifying glass, on their web page. And so they don't get scroll bars in that case, but what they do is they can move their screen magnifier around the page and see everything blown up, and makes it easier for them to read. However, you'll need to make sure that what this means is that the content is close to one another if it's related. So for example, a few years ago, CodePen had this design on their page where if you went to click on the search button in the top right corner, on the complete opposite end of the page was where the search input came up. But because those two things that are related were not in close proximity to each other, that screen magnifier, which is that little white box on the page, didn't notice there was a change. Like that whole area stays unchanged. And so it would be very easy for the user to think that nothing happened, that maybe the button is broken. So it's important that we keep the information that is close to one another and things that are activated from button clicks close to where that button click happened, so that screen magnifiers can see it. Now, CodePen since then has updated their design, and now their search input is next to the search button, and so it's a much easier experience. So to use the lens of layout, you can ask yourself these questions. Does the layout have a meaningful and logical sequence? What should happen to the layout when it's viewed on a small screen or zoomed in to 400%? And is the content that is related or changes due to user interaction in close proximity to one another? The next lens is the lens of material honesty. Now, material honesty is kind of an architectural design value. It's a term that they use, and it states that a material should be honest to itself and not be used as a substitute for another material. In other words, it states that concrete should be poured and in the end look like concrete, and it shouldn't be painted or sculpted to look like another material like bricks. If a concrete was sculpted and then painted to look like bricks, materially, that is dishonest because the user thinks it's bricks, but then behind the facade is concrete. When applied to the web, material honesty means that one element or component shouldn't look, behave, or function as if it were another element or component. In the web space and accessibility space, there's a very common notion of the button versus links debate, and that focuses on how a button and a link should look and behave. And what it kind of boils down to is buttons should look like buttons and links should look like links. And the reason being is that materially, we should make it so the user knows which is which. Here I have an example of links and buttons that are both in line in the text. Both of them are blue in this case. So as a user, would you know, based on these links or buttons, which one is which? Could you be certain before clicking on one, which one would open up an interaction on the page and which one would navigate you away? Because they're styled the same, one is materially dishonest from itself. And so we want to make sure that their intent is clear. Another example are when components gain functionality more than what they should. So in this case, we have an autocomplete menu. Now, an autocomplete menu typically will try to autocomplete the text that the user is typing into an input field. They are meant to just be lists of text that replace what the user is typing. But sometimes we like to add functionality onto those menus. We think, oh, what if we could, at the same time we're entering the text, we could delete that user and use it, or maybe modify it in some way. Once we start adding more functionality, the autocomplete menu is no longer just a list of selectable text. It then becomes a dishonest to itself. What this means is that the screen reader interaction for this becomes super difficult. Normally, a screen reader, when they come to an autocomplete menu, they can type their text, and then the screen reader will inform them that there are autocomplete choices. The user can then use the up and down arrow keys to navigate those choices, and the screen reader will read each of them out. And then they can hit enter to select that one. Once we start adding more functionality, we have to somehow inform the screen reader how this new component works, which can be very difficult and time-consuming. And in the end, since this can still result in a subpar experience for them. So the best way to keep this accessible is to keep it material honest. Have an autocomplete menu just to complete the terms or the names. Have a separate component or web page that deals with just interacting with those users and modifying them or deleting them. So to use the lens of material honesty, you can ask yourself these questions. Is the design being honest to the user? Are there any elements that behave, look, or function as another element? Are there any components that combine distinct behaviors into a single component? Does doing so make the component materially dishonest? Next, we have the lens of readability. So kind of adjacent to the lens of font, the lens of readability deals with how the page is structured to make a more readable experience for the user. So complex language and walls of text can pose lots of problems for users, especially users with cognitive disabilities or who may not be even fluent in the language of the page they're reading. As such, you should strive to make all your headings, links, controls, and labels have clear and descriptive text. Paragraphs should focus on a single idea and keep sentences short. Along with using plain and simple language, you should ensure each paragraph focuses on a single idea, because a paragraph with a single idea is easier to remember and digest, whereas the same can be true for sentences with fewer words. You should also strive to break up content with headings, lists, or images. This helps users focus better and gives them breaks in the text for their mind to process what they've read. Headings also allow users to scan the page better, looking for what they need. Use the lens of readability. You can ask yourself these questions. Is the language plain and simple? Does each paragraph focus on a single idea? Are there any long paragraphs or long blocks of unbroken text? And are all headings, links, controls, and labels clear and descriptive? The next lens we have is the lens of structure. Now, the lens of structure deals with the actual content of the page. So, for example, how would we know if this design of an 8-bracket terminant is accessible to a screen reader? If we don't understand what the structure and semantics of the page tells us, we may not understand why this is not accessible. So first, we need to understand that a screen reader interacts with the HTML of the page. And it reads that page in content sequential order. So however you write the HTML is the order that the screen reader will read it. So in terms of that single elimination bracket, typically the screen reader will read every name in the left column, followed by all the names in the second and third and so on. What that would be is that the screen reader would get to that, and what they would hear would be George, Fred, Linus, Lucy, Jack, Jill, Fred, Ginger, George, Lucy, Jack, Ginger, George, Ginger, Ginger. Now to you, could you, if by hearing that list, could you understand the bracket system? Could you understand who won what game, or even who won the tournament at all? So we need to understand basic HTML tags and how a screen reader interacts with them to know how we can better adjust this design to the user. So landmark elements, those are your headers, your nav, your footer, your main elements. They allow a screen reader to jump to important sections of the design or page. Headings, as I said, not only allows users to visually scan the page, but it also allows screen readers to visually scan the page. They can bring up a list of all headings to allow them to jump to that section, just kind of like we do visually. Lists such as ULs or OL elements group related items together, and they allow a screen reader to easily jump from one item to the next. In this example where we have a recipe, instead of the screen reader having to read it all in content order, like cakes, plain sponge, chocolate cake, apple tea cake, before getting to the biscuits section, the screen reader could just read cakes, biscuits, and breads or quick breads first. And then if the user wanted more info, they could then go into that sub list and hear all the different types of cakes. Buttons trigger interactions on the current page, while links should navigate or retrieve information from another page. So kind of understanding all of that at the basic level, how can we help improve this design? What could we add to the HTML structure to help a user understand it? Well, first we should understand what the user is after. When you're looking at this 8-person elimination chart, there are a couple of questions that come to mind. First, who is playing in what game? So if you want to know where your favorite team is playing, you'll want to know what game they're in. You'll also want to know who advanced from that game. Visually, we can tell that with the use of the connected brackets, but how would we tell someone textually who was the winner? You'd kind of have to know that the person who plays in game 5 is the person who advanced from game 1. So we can enhance the structure or the HTML of the page by adding information. So for example, we could add headings for each of the rounds of the tournament, in this case, each of those columns. We can also add subheadings to denote which game in the round that is. So now a user can say, I want to go to game 5. They can easily navigate there. We can also tell the user who won by just putting something as easy as winner after the person's name in that section. Lastly, we can order these things by lists. So we can have round 1 all as one list, and then round 2 all as a second list, and so on. Now, visually, this is kind of noisy. We wouldn't typically want to put all of this information visually for the user. So there's a technique to hide all of this information visually, but keep it there structurally in the DOM so that a screen reader can get it. So in the end, what we would end up with is exactly what visually looked like in the first slide. But if the end result visually is the same as where we started, then why bother doing this? And the answer is, as being a developer, is because we're lazy. If we don't think thoroughly about what we're doing, a lot of the times we're just going to code everything as divs. It's just easy. So even if the designer that we get the design from calls the thing a list of items, in the end, there's a chance it might just be coded as divs instead of an actual list. And so it's important that we, either as designers or developers or QA people or whatever, who are looking at the design, understand what the structural implications of the design could be, and then make sure that we code it, or we annotate the design, or we report back to the designers and developers ways that we can improve it for screen readers. So to use the lens of structure, you can ask yourself these questions. Can I outline a rough HTML structure of my design? How can I structure the design to better help a screen reader understand the content or find the content they want? How can I help the person who will implement the design understand the intended structure? And the last lens that we're going to talk about is a really short lens. It's called the lens of time. Users who need more time to perform actions should be able to adjust those time limits or remove them when possible. A lot of common time limited things are sessions. And so instead of just ending the session, we should inform the user earlier that their session is about to expire, and then allow them to either remove that notice or to extend it so that it expires later. Now, sometimes that's not possible. There's a lot of debates about time tests in the academia field, especially as we're moving more and more online. You should just know that it's very easy for users to be distracted. In the design of a very prominent design book, it informs us that we should always expect that users to be distracted or interrupted through their process. So we want to make sure that we can cater to that need as much as possible, especially now that we're all online, we're all home with all of our kids sometimes, we can always get interrupted. So to use the lens of time, you just have a single question. Is it possible to provide controls to adjust or remove time limits? So now, how can we use these lenses in a typical design? Well, first, we can start with a few at hand, and then at one at a time, carefully analyze the design through that lens. So for example, if we think back to the AccuWeather website, they had a video. So maybe we bring up and we look at the lens of video and audio, and we ask ourselves, hey, does that video autoplay when you click on the article or bring up the web page? We can ask if the video has subtitles or a transcript for a user. Maybe we then use the next lens and we analyze the page through the lens of color, and we start saying, do all these colors work for our users? Would any of the designs pose problems to users with color blindness or deficiency? So one at a time, we ask ourselves the questions, and then we adjust based on our answers to the design. As you slowly make changes to the design and you can bring in other lenses and continue to repeat the process. And this can be done, as I said, at any stage, be it early in prototyping and mockups or even after it's been shipped. You can always look at the design through these lenses. Finally, as the more inclusive you are to the needs of your users, the more you will create an accessible design for all of your users. And that's the end goal. Using these lenses is to help our designs be more accessible and more inclusive. And the more inclusive and accessible your design is, the easier it is for all users, even without disabilities, to use your web page. And that is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions about this, feel free to ask in either of the rooms. You can always get to me later. Here's that information slide again. You can find me on any of these platforms and send me an email or a tweet, or you can, again, find this presentation at that bit.ly URL.
Thank you, Stephen. While we wait just a second for that to buffer and for people to ask questions, you know, I really loved your it depends answer for how to label an image. I have to tell you, I laughed out loud. You couldn't hear me, but I did. I laughed. I thought that was great. And these, you know, I love the use of the word lenses to describe these rules. It really describes how the rules both focus your design and magnify its impact at the same time. I thought it was a really great way to present it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the lenses idea actually came from a game design book called the Game Design Lenses. So I just borrowed that kind of same principle for this. But yeah, it's a great way to focus your design especially for accessibility, when there's just so much to know, to kind of help focus you onto small bits at a time.
I thought it was really well done. So I'm not seeing any questions come in. Oh, Steve P responded. He said, I love the phrase lenses as well. He thought that was a great tool to use it. So we'll wait just a second for any other questions, but while we're closing up, make sure you stick around for the closing networking giveaways in room 1. I'm headed over there in just a minute, and so I'll see you guys there too. And please do leave feedback for your sessions as well. I'll see if I can get the Slack bot to bring that up again. It ignored me the first time, but please do leave feedback on the sessions. And Stephen, it looks like we were question free. Everybody loved your presentation. I think you did a great job. There was some great preparation there. I really appreciate you taking the time to put that together. And this will help us. Hopefully you'll start to see some good designs out there, better designs as a result of sharing some of these lenses.
Yep, that's always the hope.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you for having me.